Hi, I'm Julian from the Authz team, and welcome to the Authz video tutorial series. Authz is a Ruby gem that makes it very easy to add authorization to your Ruby on Rails application. This episode is part of a video series that covers how authorization rules work in Authz, how to install and configure the gem, and how to use the built-in admin interface. Remember that you can go to authcasestudy.herokuapp.com to interact with a live demo of the application that we're using throughout this video series. The source code is also available on GitHub for your reference. For more details about how Authz works, go to the project's README. You can find all these links in the description box. Authorization rules in Authz are configured following a particular structure. In this episode, I will explain how that structure works and give you some intuition on how to transform your authorization rules into this structure. If you have read the README, you might have seen terms like controller actions, business process, roles, and scoping rules. They are all part of this structure, and I will explain them in this episode, so don't worry if you don't know what they are. It is important that you understand the concept first, so I will leave the code bits for later episodes. If this feels a little abstract, bear with me. It will make sense once we talk about code. Let's start by doing a short recap of the demo app from the perspective of the authorization rules. If you don't know what the demo app is, watch the previous video first. Our ride-sharing app has 4 roles. Clients can list, request, and cancel services. Drivers can list, accept, or reject services that were assigned to them, and mark them as finished when they are done. Staff analysts can list services to reject or finish them on behalf of drivers, and managers can do the same actions plus canceling services on behalf of the clients. So far, we have only talked about the actions that roles are allowed to do, but the app has additional rules that define the services that each role can manipulate. Clients and drivers can only manipulate their services. Of course, it doesn't make sense that a client cancels a service from another client. Analysts and managers can act on services from their city. In this example, I have created dedicated staff roles for Melbourne and Sydney. I will talk more about why I did this later. Now that we have refreshed our memory on what the app needs in terms of authorization, let's see how we can use Authz to enforce these rules. In a nutshell, in Authz we can grant users one or many roles. If a user wants to do something, he needs to have at least one role that is authorized to do it. The authorization rules of roles are defined using 2 components. Permissions determine the actions that a role can do, and scoping rules define on which instances can roles exercise their permissions. For example, a role is permitted to cancel services and list services only on resources that belong to Sydney. Let's dive deeper into these components, starting with permissions. To do its job, our application has a services controller with multiple actions. In Authz, each controller action in the code must have a corresponding record in the controller action table created when the gem is installed. This binding might look strange, but don't worry. Authz has built-in tools to help you maintain this mapping up to date with code changes. We will talk more about this in the future. We group controller actions into higher-level groupings we call business processes. A business process represents a real-world process of your domain that is executed through one or many controller actions. For example, requesting services needs to use both the services new and the services create controller actions. Business processes are there to let developers and non-developers reason about the authorization rules using terms that make sense to their business and not in code terminology. The rest of the mapping between controller actions and business processes for our demo app is very simple. Note that there are has-many and belongs-to-many relation between controller action and business processes, so there is nothing stopping us from using the same controller action in different business processes. For example, we could say that services index is also part of the request service business process. Also note that we can group different actions from different controllers into a business process. If in the future we implement a feature that allows services to be reviewed, it could make sense to make the reviews new and reviews create controller actions part of the request services business process. There is no right or wrong way of organizing your controller actions into business processes. It really depends on your business. However, you are also welcome to adjust your groupings at any time. Since everything is configured in the database, you won't need to do any code changes. Roles are granted permissions to do some business processes. For example, clients are allowed to request services, list services, and cancel services. Note how the role descriptions read naturally when we express what a role can do in terms of business processes. Mapping the business processes for the rest of the roles is straightforward. At this point, the permissions are fully defined, but still, nothing accounts for rules like Melbourne analysts should only be able to act on services from Melbourne. This is where the scoping rules come into play. Scoping rules enable roles to execute their business processes over certain resources. For example, the Melbourne analyst role needs these 3 scoping rules to enable it to use its business processes on resources associated with the city of Melbourne, regardless of the client and the driver. 3 big questions may come to your mind. Why are we only interested in the client, driver, and city for the scoping rules? Why do we need 3 rules for each role if the rules that say all seem trivial? Where do these keywords like mine or all come from, and how are they used? Let's answer all questions one at a time. So, why focus our attention on the client, driver, and city classes and not in any other class from the app? That's because the app's authorization rules only depend on these 3 classes. For example, we only need information about the client, city, and driver to determine if any role is authorized to act on a service. We call these classes scoping classes, and they determine which scoping rules need to be created. Typically, among the classes that an application has, only a few of them are needed to model all the authorization rules. Scoping classes often represent ownership, belonging, or categorization of resources. For example, if your application has a rule that says that clients should only be able to see their orders and their reviews, then client will be a scoping class. If your business operates in different cities and you need certain roles to only have access to their city data, then city will become a scoping class. If you need information to be available according to the role's clearance, then probably your information will be tagged with the clearance level and clearance will become a scoping class. Another interesting characteristic about scoping classes is that they are part of your application's domain and they tend to remain unchanged as you add more features to your app. For example, let's say that we now want to introduce a service review feature using a review model. In this case, you would probably still want clients and drivers to be able to act only on their reviews, and staff members should only manipulate reviews based on the city that they belong to. So, despite this new feature, the scoping classes and the scoping rules for every role remain unchanged. When deciding if an action on a review is authorized, we just need to extract the client, the city, and the driver through the service. This is automatically done by Authz, but we will talk more about it when we talk about code. The next question is, why do we need 3 rules per role? It might feel redundant to have to declare that a client has access to resources from all drivers and all cities when the only apparent restriction should be to limit access to only his resources. The reason is that Authz is a closed by default system, and scoping rules are used to whitelist the resources that a role has access to with respect to scoping classes. For example, let's say that I log in as client number 5 and I want to retrieve all services that are within my scope. Since Authz knows the application scoping classes, it automatically manages access based on the associated client, city, and driver. By default, Authz will deny access unless otherwise stated by a scoping rule. If clients are only granted the client mine scoping rule, Authz will release the client's related lock on my services, but the services are still locked by the other scoping classes. When we add scoping rules, we gain access to the correct services. Finally, let's answer the question of where do these keywords like mine or all come from and how are they used. We call this part of the scoping rules the keyword of the scoping rule. For example, the Melbourne analyst role has a scoping rule for the city scoping class with the Melbourne keyword. While analyzing the application's authorization rules, developers decide which scoping classes and keywords are needed to model those authorization rules. For our ride-sharing app, we needed the keywords mine and all for both client and driver, and we decided to use the name as the keyword for the city scoping class. The reason for this will become clear very soon. In addition to choosing which keywords need to be available, developers also code what each keyword resolves to. For example, somewhere in the code of the demo app we have declared that the available keywords for client are mine and all, and that mine means resources that are associated with a client that matches my client ID. We will discuss the code part in more detail in future episodes. For now, you just need to understand that the keywords we make available are a design choice and that we use them to model our authorization rules. Now that we know how the rule structure works, let's drive the point home by seeing how Authz determines if an action of a resource is authorized. Let's say that a user, John Doe, has been granted the roles of Melbourne Analyst and Sydney Manager. John is trying to cancel Service 10 from Melbourne, and our app has routed his request to Services Client Cancel Controller Action. To determine if John is allowed to do that, he needs to have at least one role that allows him to do so. Melbourne analysts do not have permission to cancel services, so we need to check the rest of the roles. Acting as a Sydney manager, he has the permission to cancel services but only on resources from Sydney. So the result is that John is not authorized to do that action. If John tried to cancel another service that belonged to Sydney, he would be able to do so through his Sydney manager role. The reason why we decided to create dedicated analyst and manager roles per city was to allow users to have different roles on different cities. This may or may not be needed in your app, so it is up to you to decide which roles do you want to support. The cool thing about using this structure is that it allows you to easily redefine or create new roles intuitively and without doing any code changes. For example, imagine that we are now requested to support a general manager role that should be able to do the same things as a city manager, but with access to all cities the company operates in. Defining the role is just a matter of granting the relevant business processes and creating the applicable scoping rules, and we are done. Hopefully, everything makes sense so far. Now, how do you know if Authz will be a good match for your needs? Authz was built to support a family of authorization rules that is very common. However, there are many other types of rules that are not supported. If you can break down your authorization rules into the Authz structure, then your rules are supported and you will benefit enormously from using the gem. In other words, if your rules are about allowing roles to do some actions over a subset of resources, then you should be able to use Authz. On the other hand, if you have rules that depend on things other than actions and resources, they will not be supported by Authz. For example, users must be denied access after 10 p.m. Users must be granted access based on their IP address. Customers must be denied the transaction when the amount is greater than 5,000. So what happens if you need to support these types of rules? If most of your rules are supported and there are only a few outliers, we recommend you to use Authz and code the outlier rules yourself. However, if these rules are very common in your app, you're better off using a different authorization gem altogether. We recommend Pondit. This is the end of this episode about how authorization rules work in Authz. In the following episodes, we will talk about how to install and configure the gem and how to use the built-in admin interface. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.